an oil refinery on the edge of Moscow, burning. It was hit by a small propeller drone that flew here on its own for hundreds of kilometers. And they keep coming. Hundreds a night. More than the defenses can stop. Here is the strange part. Ukraine did not do this with a wonder weapon or by winning some duel against Russia's air defenses. It did it with arithmetic, with drones so cheap and so numerous that the maths of shooting them all down simply stopped working. For most of this war, targets this deep inside Russia were effectively untouchable, and the refineries that pay for the fighting sat safely out of reach. This is the story of how an aircraft costing less than a used car put the industrial heart of a much larger country permanently within reach. Not in a single spectacular raid, but as a slow, grinding, almost routine campaign that Russia has so far been unable to stop. Here is how this briefing runs. First, the sanctuary. Why the heart of Russia was, for years, effectively off limits. Second, the math that broke that sanctuary. Third, the saturation tactic that beats a defense you cannot outfly. Fourth, why the drones are aimed at refineries above all else. And fifth, what it means that a country's depth is no longer the shield it used to be. To see what changed, start with how safe the inside of Russia used to be. For most of the war, the fighting and the wreckage stayed in one place, along the front and in the border regions. Deep inside Russia, life went on. The refineries ran, the trains moved, the capital carried on. And crucially, the machine that funded the entire war effort, Russia's vast oil and refining industry, sat hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers from any front line. Distance alone was a kind of armor. The oil and gas that paid for the state flowed out of pipelines and export terminals that had barely been scratched. In 3 years of the largest war in Europe since 1945, the single most important thing keeping Russia in the fight, its energy revenue, had been left almost entirely alone. On top of distance sat a shield. Around Moscow and its most valuable sites, Russia stacked layers of air defense missiles, some of the most capable in the world, built to knock down fast, expensive threats. Fighter jets, bombers, cruise missiles. Against the handful of high-value targets it was designed for, that shield was formidable. The assumption underneath it was simple. Anything trying to reach Moscow would be rare, fast, and worth a very expensive missile to destroy. A whole doctrine and a whole budget was built on that single assumption. It was about to meet a threat that was none of those things. Not rare, not fast, and not worth $1 million missile at all. So the core of the country was doubly protected. Too far away to reach easily, and too well defended to reach cheaply. The oil kept flowing, the revenue kept coming, and the war kept being paid for. All from a sanctuary that the fighting never really touched. Breaking that sanctuary is the whole story of the last year. The sanctuary was not broken by a better weapon. It was broken by a cheaper one. This is the tool that did it. A long-range strike drone, fixed-wing, propeller-driven, with a small warhead in the nose and a range that now reaches well over 1,000 kilometers. It is slow, it is not stealthy, and on its own it is easy to shoot down. But it has one decisive quality. It is cheap. Depending on the type, one of these costs somewhere between a few thousand and perhaps $50,000. Ukraine builds them in furniture workshops and converted factories by the thousand. There is no single model. Some, like the Liuti, are purpose-built long-range strike drones. Others are adapted from sport planes or built up around plywood and off-the-shelf engines. One of the cheapest, the FP1, is reported to cost around $50,000, with a range of up to 3,000 kilometers. Being slow and simple is not a weakness here. It is the whole point. An airframe cheap enough to send in numbers no expensive weapon could ever hope to match. Now look at what it takes to stop one. The missiles guarding Moscow are marvels of engineering, and each one costs a fortune, from several $100,000 to several million for the top-tier interceptors. So consider the exchange. To reliably destroy a single drone that might have cost $50,000, the defender may fire a missile worth 10 or 20 times as much. Win that engagement, and you have still lost the trade. And this is the heart of the math. The attacker can build drones faster and far more cheaply than the defender can build the missiles to stop them. In early 2026, Ukraine's drone output jumped more than 300%. Every cheap drone launched forces the defender to either spend a far more expensive missile or let it through. Do that thousands of times, and no air defense budget on Earth can keep pace. So the breakthrough was never about flying higher or faster than the shield. It was about making the shield too expensive to hold up. You do not defeat the defense. You bankrupt it, one cheap aircraft at a time. Cheap drones only matter if enough of them arrive at once. That is the second half of the method. A single drone against a modern air defense will usually lose, so Ukraine does not send a single drone. It sends waves, dozens or hundreds at a time, from many directions at once. An air defense system can only track and engage so many targets in the same few minutes. Flood it with more than it can handle, and the maths of the defense inverts. It is no longer picking off rare intruders, it is being swarmed. Some always get through. And to make it harder still, the waves are mixed. Real strike drones flying alongside cheap decoys, so the defenders cannot tell which contacts are worth a precious missile and which are empty airframes meant only to soak one up. Every decoy shot down is another real drone that flies on unmolested. The scale is now enormous. Across the first half of 2026, Ukraine averaged well over 200 long-range drone sorties every single day. In one night alone, Russia reported shooting down around 660 drones and decoys across the country. On another, nearly 200 were aimed at the Moscow region by itself. Even a defense that stops the overwhelming majority is now dealing with hundreds of leakers a week. And Russia has no single integrated system watching all of this. There is no unbroken radar net covering the whole country. The defense is stitched together facility by facility, site by site, which is exactly what makes it possible to overwhelm one place at a time and slip through the seams between them. And because there are never enough interceptors everywhere, Russia has to choose. It concentrates its best systems around Moscow and a few critical nodes, which means stripping air defense away from dozens of other regions. By some accounts, more than 60 regions were left thinned out. Every gap that opens is another refinery, in some quiet region, suddenly within easy reach. This is the uncomfortable truth of it. The defense can win almost every single duel, shoot down 95 or more of every 100 drones, and still lose. Because the few that leak through do not hit empty fields. They hit the one target that was worth the whole effort. Which raises the obvious question. Of everything in Russia, why aim at the refineries? Because a refinery is where oil turns into two things Russia needs to fight: fuel for its own war machine and refined products it sells abroad for cash. Hit the refineries and you attack the fuel and the funding at the same time. And a refinery is almost the perfect target. It is enormous, it cannot move, and its most vital parts, the tall distillation columns where crude is boiled and separated, stand out in the open, thin-skinned and impossible to hide. You do not even need to destroy the whole plant. A single drone into the right column can take a processing unit offline, and with it, a meaningful slice of that refinery's entire output. And here is the part that makes it hurt. Those distillation units are precision-built, and many of their key components came from Western manufacturers, exactly the companies now barred from selling to Russia by sanctions. So when a column is knocked out, it cannot simply be patched overnight. The spare parts are hard to get. The repairs drag on for months, and until then, that slice of the refinery and its output is simply gone. The cumulative effect has been staggering. Ukraine has now struck all of Russia's largest refineries, many of them repeatedly. At the peak, strikes had knocked out something approaching 40% of the country's refining capacity. Gasoline output fell sharply. Fuel shortages spread to 2/3 of Russia's regions, with queues at petrol stations thousands of kilometers from the war, and the losses to the refining sector ran into the tens of billions of dollars. Russia was pushed into a humiliating reversal, selling its own crude oil abroad at a discount, while buying refined fuel back at a premium to cover the shortages at home. Its central bank warned that months of refineries running below capacity would weigh on the entire year's economic growth. For the first time in the war, the financial engine itself was sputtering. So the drones are not aimed at soldiers or trenches. They are aimed at the balance sheet and at the fuel tank of the entire war. A frontline target costs the enemy a position. A refinery costs him the money and the fuel to keep fighting everywhere else. Step back. And this is bigger than one war. It is a change in a very old rule. For as long as there have been wars, sheer size and depth have been a form of safety. Put your factories and your capital far enough behind the lines, and the enemy simply could not reach them without an air force he usually did not have. That is the rule that just broke. A country's depth is only a shield if the enemy cannot afford to reach across it. Cheap, long-range drones have made reaching across it affordable. The last time a great power's homeland was taken apart from the air, it took 1,000 bomber raids, vast fleets, and staggering losses in crews and machines. Now it takes a workshop, a supply of cheap engines and patience. And every military on Earth is watching. The lesson is not really about Russia or even about oil. It is that a large number of cheap, expendable machines can now hold at-risk targets that used to sit safely behind the most expensive air defenses money can buy. The advantage has quietly shifted, at least for now, toward the side that can be cheap and numerous, rather than the side that is merely strong. Navies worry about their ships, air forces about their bases, and every capital about its refineries and power plants, because the same cheap, patient logic that reached Moscow can, in principle, reach almost anywhere. That is the real takeaway, and it outlasts this war. When the weapon that can reach your heartland costs less than the missile you would fire to stop it, distance stops being a wall and starts being a liability. A long, undefendable stretch of ground the enemy can now cross for little more than the price of a used car again and again, night after night. Russia's core is no longer a sanctuary. It is a target list. A weaker side reached the heart of a stronger one by being cheap, patient, and numerous. Next time, what happens when both sides can do this? When the cheap machines fill the sky in their thousands, and the question is no longer whether they get through, but whether anyone can defend anything at all. Keep watching the map and watch the price tags. In modern war, the cheapest weapon on the board is often the most dangerous.